Hi there and welcome back to part 2 of the AI tutorial, the redo of the AI tutorial. Now we've got this far. You should have managed to get the character moving towards the center. Now the center is not a great idea, so the next step is to make sure that we start working on this code to get it a bit more useful. So the first step is that we need an actual target rather than just going to some zero position. Now the target will be your player most of the time, and we're going to build a player later on in one of the next tutorials, but right now we're just going to use an empty game object. So what we're going to do right now is we're just going to create ourselves some kind of target game object. So if you click on game object, you go to 3D object, and let's just use a sphere. And this sphere, I'm just going to hold Control and Shift and click on it to move it to a position somewhere on my scene. I'm happy enough with it. You notice I've added another colour here, so I'm going to make this one red. I'm going to put red on the actual sphere so that we can kind of see it, so we can see it there. Oh yeah, there's one little thing here. If we zoom in here, when you press Control Shift and you move it around, it goes by the centre. The reason for that often is that the pivot and center are kind of different, so if you change the pivot point here to center and then move it like that, it'll use the collider to position itself. So I'm fairly happy with that where it is. We could make it bigger if you want to, but it's up to you. So I've got the we want this object now to be the center, so I'm going to call this for want of a better word, I'm going to call this player, and we're just going to manually move it around before we write some code to move it around as our player. What we need is that the enemy knows about the player. There's a couple of ways to do this. One of the sort of most common ways in Unity is that we tag this as a player, so that when we spawn lots of enemies in, each of the enemies that spawn in look for a particular tagged object and use that as their target. So I'm just going to do that right now. If you click, so we've got this player object selected, I'm going to click on untagged and change that to player. It's such a common thing, such a common tag that it's included by default. You don't have to even make one. So we've tagged this as player. It's also called player, but we've tagged it as player, and that's really important because we can use that inside of our code to find the enemy. And I'll show you why it's useful right now. So we have another variable to add in here. So I'm going to call this, I'm just going to say it's a transform. So I'm going to say transform, and then say player with a lowercase p. And then, just like we did with the nav mesh, what we're going to do is we're going to grab it inside of the start function. So we're going to say player equals. This time we use game object with a capital G dot find game object with tag. Now you have to be really careful here because there's two of them. One of find game objects, which finds, as you can see from the help, an array of game objects, and that's handy if you needed to find lots and lots of things all tagged with the same thing. So if you had enemies, for example, you could find all of the enemies of a particular tag with enemy or something like that. But we want to have the find game object singular, find game object with tag. And then inside of the quote marks inside of the brackets is the tag that we're looking for, and it was player with a capital P. Now make sure you get the capital P because it will not work without. Now you notice here that it's got this little underline. The reason for that is if you hover over it, it shows you that this returns a game object, not a transform. Now it's not the end of the world. We could simply turn this into game object and then everything would be fine. Or what we could do if we just want the transform, so we just want the position and rotation and scale, we just basically just looking for the position. So what we can do at the end of this is we can say dot transform, and that just says, so we'll get the game object, this part here gets the game object, and this gets the transform of that. So we don't actually store the whole game object, we just store the transform in player. And then, assuming this all works, the only thing we need to change inside of the update here is that we want player. Again, if you hover over, you'll see it says player. Well, okay, it's looking for a vector 3, which is a position, and it can't convert a transform to a vector 3, so we'll just say player dot position, and that will give us the vector 3 of the position of the player. Now, there's a little bit of explanation, more than I intended, but it's got its reasons. So you see, if you play this now, what we should, once everything is saved, I'll jump back to scene. What we should see is that it moves towards the red guy, the target, the player, because he's targeted as player. And if I move this around, you'll see he goes in the direction of that player as well. So if this happened to be the player and we were moving around, this would currently follow us. So yeah, next part would be we need to create some states for this so that we are able to not move until we're either within a certain distance or within sight. So we'll do this in part 3.